Welcome to the Legislative Affairs Committee meeting for the City Council of Fitchburg. Today is October 13th, 2020. The public was invited to participate in the Zoom webinar. We had one person register, but I don't see that person on here. We have 4 petitions on the agenda. We're going to take them a little out of order. The first item on the agenda that we'll address right now is 19220 New View Communities and 62 to 82 Academy Street, Inc. to amend the boundaries of the downtown smart grown zoning district as outlined in the enclosed petition, also referred to the Planning Board and Community Development. And I understand that Mr. Tom Skorosky is here to speak to that. Mr. Skorosky, are you here?
I am. I'm trying to multitask between Planning Board and the other computer. So can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Great.
Thanks for taking things out of order this evening. My question's pretty simple one tonight. Basically, you know, the Fitchburg Arts Community Project was approved through our 40R Smart Growth District. And the New View Communities team in kind of doing their due diligence and working with the state for many of the various tax credits and other funding programs that are at offer to make that project happen. There's a lot of legal work involved in really reviewing decisions and making sure that you know, they can kind of hold the test of time, if you will. And one of their folks on the legal team flagged a potential issue that they wanted to correct with this action tonight. And what it basically is pretty simple. We approved the arts community as part of the 40R district, but technically speaking, part of the parking lot is actually outside of that district. It's Low Park, and Low Park is in the RB zoning district. So what we would basically be doing is including Low Park as part of that smart growth overlay. Hopefully the council and the planning board later this evening will also be voting on this, and then hopefully the council can ratify it later, and at which point we'd go to the state and get their approval. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward matter. Happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Okay, so my understanding from what you just said is that what we're doing is we're taking a small part of that parking lot and including it into the area that would be necessary to continue with this project.
That's correct. Technically under zoning, it's not allowed to have in residential districts just what this would be is a commercial parking lot. Okay. So by including it as part of the district, then it's part of the development. It's not just, you know, you could think of the worst case scenarios where you have commercial parking lots randomly in residential districts, and that's something our zoning, generally speaking, has sought to avoid.
Okay. Do I have any other questions I have a motion to approve from Councilor Zarella.
Second.
And a second from Councilor Di Natale. I guess we can do this by roll call vote. Councilor Di Natale on the motion?
Yes.
Councilor Zarella?
Yes.
Councilor Walsh, I am a yes as well, and it passes 3-0.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Skorosky.
Have a good evening.
Okay, thank you. The next item on the agenda that we'll take right now is 204-20. Jeff Morosky, Deputy Commissioner of Wastewater, to request changes to the City Code, Chapter 147, Sewers, as outlined in the enclosed petition. And there's a letter as well, and I will read the letter. Dear Council President Michael Kushmarek and members of the Council, attached is respectfully submitted requested changes to City Code Chapter 147 Sewers. These changes fall within the following categories: incorporation of EPA-approved local limits, which need to be promulgated into ordinance; incorporation of changes required by Pretreatment Streamlining Rule of the National Pretreatment Program, 40 CFR 403, which need to be promulgated into ordinance; and correcting inadvertent erroneous changes from May 9th, 2019, Mayor signed, May 7th, 2019, Council approved Ordinance 120-19, Amendment to Chapter 147. The submitted changes neither add nor any new fees or charges, nor do these changes alter any pre-existing fees or charges amounts that have been previously voted and approved by the council. If there are any questions, please contact DPW Deputy Commissioner Jeff Morosky. Sincerely, Fitchburg DPW Wastewater Division, Jeffrey Morosky. And I believe we have Mr. Morosky here with us. Mr. Morosky, could you maybe outline the changes? I don't know if there's a way to do this quickly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. The cover letter really served to distill the changes down into three major areas. The attachment that accompanied the cover letter, and that was in the council packet, is in excess of 30 pages. A lot of this has to do with changes that were mandated by EPA to industrial pretreatment programs. It also included something called local limits, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. I have with me engineer Neil Cheseldine from Wright Pierce. Neil was the lead engineer with Wright Pierce, who was helping us with the local limits study. And then the last area had to do with just a couple minor changes. There was an omission in the last iteration of ordinance updating that removed the sewer connection fees, the schedule of sewer connection fees. So that's being reinserted. And then respectfully, I'd like to request two amendments to the submitted document. In those 30-something pages, I had two minor errors that I need to correct. The first one had to do with page number 14 out of 39, and it was change number 2. I simply made a typo on the Mass General Law that was cited. In what I submitted in the packet, it said Chapter 93, Section 10. It's actually Chapter 83, Section 10.
Okay.
And then the second revision I'd like to amend on the floor has to do with the specific local limits. And I've got these documents as PDFs. I don't know if you'd like us to email them to the council members, or how you'd like me to share this, aside from visually sharing my screen.
I think you can visually share the screen if you like, so that everyone
Okay.
can see what you're talking about.
I'm sharing the wrong screen. I apologize. I'm not the seasoned veteran at this that I'd like to think that I was.
We're all learning.
Okay, I think that this is the right one. My apologies.
No problem.
Okay. Can you see my screen? It says change alterations as the header.
Yes.
I can maximize that. Now, this is the first minor change. This is the typo. In the third line, you'll see Chapter 83, Section 10. That's the corrected language.
Okay.
This change has to do with the commission has language within the ordinance that they have the authority to promulgate rules and regs. This is not changing ordinance. This is essentially a side-by-side document that helps in the utilization and the interpretation, if you will, of the ordinance. And it's really more user-friendly to a developer or a proponent, someone that's looking to get a sewer connection. And the second change has to do with the specific local limits. I had a briefer lead-in paragraph number 1 on this that was a carryover from an older ordinance version. What this is really saying is that the below table represents the total aggregation of pollutant loads and measured in pounds per day that the treatment plant can receive at the headworks and still treat without violating our permit. That's essentially what this means. It was misrepresented before where it could have been interpreted that any one user could discharge this amount of pollutant per day, and that's not the case. This is the total aggregated amount.
Okay. And what page is this in the document, Mr. Morosky?
This one is on page number 31, the
39
second
or
one.
39. Okay.
Correct.
All right. And if you could just send those to me in an email, and then I'll include those in the minutes when I send the minutes, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, my pleasure. With that, I would like to turn things over to Mr. Neil Cheseldine. We've got a brief presentation. This is intended to be high view presentation and not down deep in the weeds.
Okay.
If you were to have any specific questions, we'll be happy to answer them afterwards.
Okay. And if you can stop sharing your screen, and that way we can get him in there. Thank you. Okay.
You're welcome.
Mr. Cheseldine, if you could go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let me get my screen going. Is that coming through for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Jeff asked me to be in attendance tonight to give as he put it, a high-level overview of our work with the industrial pretreatment program for Fitchburg, and specifically the local limits, and then also an overview of the streamlining rule, which Jeff mentioned. So I'll give an overview of the industrial pretreatment program. Also talk about how local limits are a part of the industrial pretreatment program and the results of our recent reevaluation of your local limits, and then some general thoughts on the EPA streamlining rule. So the industrial pretreatment program. Why do we need an industrial pretreatment program? Most all that we deal with in the wastewater treatment world stems from the Clean Water Act, which put in place provisions for monitoring and regulating industrial wastewater in addition to normal, regular domestic wastewater. And it was very explicit on the domestic wastewater that carries with it specific limits for a small number of pollutants, largely due to the fact that domestic wastewater is generally quite predictable. And so it's possible to have a standard set of limits and pollutants that we're monitoring and keep the waters clean. When we start dealing with industrial waste streams, things become a lot more complicated. There are many more chemicals that end up in the waste stream out of industries, and industrial waste in general can be highly variable from day to day. So it requires kind of a higher level and a different level of monitoring and regulation in order to effectively protect the city's treatment plant and the water quality of the river that it discharges to. So when we think about industrial wastewater, it does pose some threats to your successful operation of your treatment plant on a number of levels. And so basically the goal of the IPP is to allow the city to protect its facility from things like staff safety. Generally, we're talking about hazardous gases is the biggest one there. The infrastructure, if things are highly corrosive, that can lead to premature wear and breakdown of equipment. Then as I mentioned, the receiving water quality criteria, which is linked with the treatment plant's discharge limits in its NPDES permit, the NPDES discharge permit. We also look at the the treatment process itself. We rely on biological treatment of the wastewater that comes into the plant. And for that, we grow microorganisms. And some of those microorganisms are susceptible to the same sort of chemicals that are in some industrial waste. So that can inhibit the growth, which can be a problem and cause treatment to not work as well as it should. We call that treatment process inhibition. And it can lead to pass-through, meaning that the pollutants that come in don't get treated as they're supposed to. And finally, at the tail end, because we're a biological process, we're growing microorganisms, we have excess biosolids or sludge to dispose of or beneficially use. Generally, when we're treating for a lot of these different pollutants, the treatment occurs because those pollutants end up being adsorbed into the biomass. If we put too much of those pollutants into the biomass, we create an end product that is much more difficult to dispose of or beneficially use. So we want to protect against that by the loadings that we allow to come into the head end of the treatment plant, into the headworks, as Jeff referenced. So essentially, the industrial pretreatment program is an additional EPA mandated program that applies to only certain municipalities, basically municipalities that have a significant component of industrial waste in their collection system. So not all towns and cities do have that, but many do, and Fitchburg is one of those. So for Fitchburg in particular, and how we got to this point, the city has always had local limits. We were focused, as I say, on local limits, which is a portion of the industrial pretreatment program. The existing limits have been in place for a long time, to the point that the actual technical basis for those limits was, and for many of them, was unknown at this point. And also, the general characteristics of the Fitchburg system have changed quite a bit since they were initially developed, probably back in the 80s and 90s. So in 2010, the city was issued a new discharge permit, which is normally a 5-year occurrence by the EPA. And as a standard condition of the permit, there was a requirement to reassess the technical basis of the existing local limits. And so that's what we were assisting the city to do. The initial reassessment determined that, yes, new limits would be required. And so that process got underway and was sort of suspended in 2013, because at that same point in time, the city was involved in a couple of, or numerous significant upgrades to the treatment facility, both the chemically enhanced primary treatment upgrade and also the secondary system upgrade, both of which impacted the treatment efficiency, changed the removals or the treatment efficiency for the various different pollutants. And that's a key factor in how we go about calculating the necessary local limits. So the decision was made to suspend that effort until those upgrades were complete, in order to use the latest and greatest characteristics of the treatment process to calculate the limits. So those upgrades have been underway, going on since that time. And in 2019, we finalized our evaluation and report on the recommended local limits, which was then submitted to the EPA. And it went to the EPA because in the state of Massachusetts, the industrial pretreatment program, the regulatory authority for that is actually the EPA, not the Mass DEP. So what are local limits for? What's their purpose? Essentially, no two treatment plants are alike in all ways. And so the process of developing local limits is to factor in all of the unique factors of whatever municipality we happen to be doing it for, in order to best match those limits to the conditions of the treatment process and the treatment plant and the discharge to the receiving water, the limits for the treatment plant, how they get rid of their sludge, biosolids, all of those things come into play. Generally speaking, the goal of local limits is to protect the publicly owned treatment works from pass-through, which is essentially anything that causes a violation of one of your discharge permit limits, or interference, anything that interferes or disrupts the operation of the POTW. So essentially, it's the same threats that I listed on the previous slide that we look at, that we want to prevent by having stringent enough local limits to prevent problems from occurring due to these things. Once those local limits are developed and approved and implemented, then they're going to be used as the basis for the staff to develop new or revised discharge permits for each of the industrial users. Also, with these new limits, because they've gone through EPA approval, that provides the city with an added level of defense should users question those limits. You know, you've got a technical basis now, and you've put it through the highest regulatory authority, and they've okayed them. But of course, before we can start implementing them, we need to incorporate them into the city ordinance, because the existing and under the current conditions right now, the permits that are issued to the industrial users are based on an outdated set of local limits that are no longer defensible. So from our work, looking at the different pollutant parameters, we came up with recommendations for limits. We classified those limits into two different types. The first, numerical local limits, we determined were necessary for these 5 different pollutants: aluminum, copper, mercury, BOD, and TSS. We determined that they needed numerical limits because we determined that there was a reasonable potential that with the current loadings from the current industries, there was potential that you could exceed the maximum capacity of the plant to accept those types of loadings into the headworks. But we looked at a much longer list of pollutants, and many of which we found that there was no reasonable potential under the current conditions that they would cause a problem at current levels with the operation of the treatment plant or the rest of the infrastructure. But it makes sense to continue to monitor those pollutants because things change. You know, either the nature of the specific industry changes or new industries come to town, either one of which can change the levels of these. And so it's worthwhile to continue to keep tabs on them, but you have flexibility to do it as you see fit. So the summary of all that was, as with all good engineering reports, was a table with many, many numbers. And what we see here is to draw attention to would be the center column become the actual recommended local limits, which were set up on a mass basis, as Jeff mentioned, on a pounds per day in aggregate for all of the industries. And then the final 2 columns are important to look at to know, what is the impact of this ultimately to your users, to the industrial users of the system. The last column is the current average concentration of these pollutants that we're seeing based on sampling from the industries themselves presently. The column before that, the second to last column, is what the concentration limit would be based on the mass local limit at the current total flow of industrial wastewater. So it's what the takeaway from this is to notice that the values in the last column are all less than the values in the second to last column, which means that as things stand right now, the treatment plant does have the capacity to accept all loadings of these pollutants from the industrial users without the industrial users needing to implement any forms of additional pre-treatment. So that's going to be reassuring and comforting to your industrial users. So specifically, what are the impacts to the users? So you have 8 significant industrial users presently that I've listed here. We've, as I said, kind of partitioned the limits into numerical limits and screening limits, which is different than how it used to be. This will allow the city greater flexibility to use its discretion in setting numerical limits and/or testing frequency to each individual industry, which is good for both the city and the industrial users. As I said before, the existing loadings from the significant industrial users are less than the local limits, which means there should be no compliance issues that result from the adoption of these new limits. So ultimately, of course, once we've gone through the process of adopting these local limits into your ordinance, then the individual discharge permits to each of the significant industrial users will need to be revised and reissued to reflect these new local limits. So moving on to the streamlining rule. It's got a nice name, and it almost does do what it sounds like it's supposed to do from the title. The genesis of the streamlining rule from the EPA's perspective was to kind of acknowledge that the fact that, the rules and regulations that had sort of come about out of the Clean Water Act were kind of a one-size-fits-all type approach. But there's also an acknowledgement that no single, all these IPP programs in each different municipality are different, and all the industries are different. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to force the city to go about doing monitoring in one way that might not be appropriate or necessary for all industries. And so this provides a greater level of flexibility. And as I said, so the city will have more flexibility to set up your permits and to set up your monitoring requirements to better meet the actual conditions of your users. Instead, still adequately protect your infrastructure from problems. So specifically, it's intended to reduce the regulatory burden on the city, on any control authority. That's what they would deem the city to be. In that you may reduce sampling frequency. You may classify certain significant industrial users as non-significant. And by doing so, you would reduce your required amount of oversight of those particular entities. You may use BMPs as an alternative to numerical limits. What do I mean by that? BMP stands for best management practices. And so in some instances, it sometimes makes sense to prescribe a certain way an industry handles its waste, as opposed to simply getting a sample of what comes out its pipe and measuring something. An example might be, say, an ice cream manufacturer that happens to be dumping all its spent waste, Class B ice cream down the drain, where you might say, look, let's put that somewhere else, not down the drain. Let's make it go into another receptor that can then be handled as an organic waste some other way and not come into the wastewater. It also provides better definition on what constitutes significant noncompliance, which is quite important because ultimately it's that sort of an event that dictates and mandates that the city spring into action with enforcement action, and it sometimes becomes a gray area. So hopefully this will clarify things and make it more straightforward and understandable as to when, what response is required when there's a sampling event that indicates a need to respond. All of these may provisions that I've in a few others that I haven't listed here, but anything with a may provision is basically something that the city at its option can adopt or not. The EPA will allow you to keep things more stringent if you so choose, but you now have the flexibility to adjust your program to reflect the latitudes given in the streamlining rule. There are some changes that are more stringent, and so those will have to be adopted into your ordinance if they're not already in there. And there's quite a wide range of those topics that I didn't list here. Ultimately, all of those changes that you put together, which is essentially what tonight's meeting is talking about adopting into your ordinance, will have to be done just that, adopted into the ordinance, and so the ordinance will have to be resubmitted to the EPA for approval. And once that occurs, then you'll be at liberty to essentially roll it out and start using it. So that's my 40,000 foot version. Open for questions if there are any. Hopefully I haven't put too many people to sleep.
Thank you, Mr. Cheseldine. Councilor Zarella, you have a question.
Yes, so of these matters that were just discussed, how many of these potential changes and so forth are encompassed by what we're voting on tonight?
I believe all of them. I think all the streamlining changes were incorporated into that suggested or proposed changes to the ordinance, and certainly the local limits were also.
Okay, thank you.
So the only thing that doesn't occur with what we have here, the next step in the process will be to develop individual discharge permits for each of the industries. That's not yet here. And I'm not
Okay.
quite sure of your process for pushing those out, whether that comes before this committee individually or if they're handled at staff level.
No, I appreciate it. I usually try to be a bit better informed on the bills, but I've been a little distracted this past week or two.
This isn't the juiciest topic I bet you guys deal with.
Congratulations, by the way, Councilor Zarella.
Thank you. Thank you.
One thing I would like to add, my predecessor, Joe Jordan, had compiled an ordinance change in 2013 to 2014 timeframe. I didn't come into this position until June of 2014. Joe had gotten a ordinance update approved by EPA, and he was supposed to, or he intended to bring it forward to council for ordinance adoption, and for whatever reason, it didn't happen. So a lot of what we're putting forward here, especially as it relates to the streamlining rule, is language that we had previously presented to EPA and the EPA had approved, and we simply didn't get it incorporated. In particular, the definitions, there's a laundry list of definitions. A lot of those, or the majority of those, have to do with the streamlining rule requirements. There's reporting requirements, that's section number 3. There are self-monitoring regulations, that's section number 4 of the changes. These are all related to the streamlining rule changes, as is the pretreatment of industrial wastewater section, which is number 5. And also confidential information, number 6. So a lot of these 39 pages that I put forward to the council has to do with these streamlining rule changes and being compliant with those mandates by EPA.
So Mr. Morosky, if we pass this tonight, if we change these ordinances, this will bring us current and in line with EPA regulations in accordance with IPP requirements?
With respect to the streamlining rule, and the local limits is an independent but related subtopic.
Okay.
And that has to do with the study that we did for the East plant.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? I would entertain a motion.
Motion to approve.
Seconded.
Motion by Councilor Zarella and seconded by Councilor Schultz. And we'll do this by roll call vote. Councilor Di Natale,
Yes.
Councilor Schultz,
Yes.
Councilor Zarella,
Yes.
and I am a yes. That passes 4-0. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a learning experience, to say the least.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Should I sit tight for the council as a whole with respect to this petition, or would that not matter? The committee will submit a report to council
We
tonight,
will
correct?
we'll submit a report to the minutes to the city council meeting, and that will be taken up at the next council meeting.
Okay.
If possible, could we get a copy of Mr. Cheseldine's presentation as well, and I will submit that along with the minutes to the city clerk.
PDF version will be acceptable?
That's perfectly fine.
Okay, absolutely. So
Okay.
the floor amended changes I'll provide, and then also Mr. Cheseldine's presentation I'll provide.
Excellent, thank you. And it might be helpful if you were on board for the city council meeting, because it's so technical, it might be a good idea for you to be present for questions.
Okay,
All right,
very good.
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. And next, we are going to take up petition 12820. Councilor Paul Boschman to petition that all applications for a dealer's license must be, oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. My apologies, I'm reading the wrong one. The second one, we're going to take up 2820, Councilor Paul Boschman to amend chapter 16958, winter parking ban, to increase fee from $30 to $60 per day when the winter parking ban is in place. And my understanding that Councilor Boschman is here to present his reasoning for his petition. And then Chief Martineau is also here to comment on this petition. Councillor Boschman.
Yes, hi, how are you?
Thank you, Councillor.
The reason why I put that petition is because I feel that $30 is not enough to be charging somebody to be parking on the city streets when we have a snowstorm. It costs people more money to plow their driveways than what we charge for somebody to park on the city streets. It's cheaper for them to leave their cars on the street and have the city come back and replow the street and have their parking spot plowed already than to park in their own yard or in a place. $30 to me is not, it's not hurting anybody. It's really helping them. It's cheaper. Like I keep on emphasizing, it's cheaper for a plow guy to come and push the snow and park there and pay the $30, where an average price is about 40 or 50 to do a driveway, if they parked in the driveway. So we're not really stopping people from parking on the streets. Well, we're saying, go ahead and we'll push the snow back, move your car, we'll come back and push it for free. So just give me a $30 ticket and that's it, if we get the ticket. So that's the reason why the petition went in. I think, eliminate a lot of the problems that we have in the congested areas where people don't want to move their cars or walk to move, parking in the locations that the city designates as parking. They rather just leave them there. So that's the reason why the petition went in. I'm a firm believer that I'm not trying to take advantage of anybody. I understand that money's tight for a lot of people, but it costs the taxpayers money when the city has to go back around and re-push the snow around, push it back to make our streets wider because cars were parked there. And I have driven around in many snowstorms, and I have seen it from my own eyes that there have been a lot of cars on streets where the city had to go back and push the snow. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Chief Martineau, would you like to comment on this?
Councilor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
And now I think your screen is frozen, but there you go.
I'm not sure if I have a bad internet.
Yep.
I'm not sure if I have a bad internet connection. I'm at the police station, so I apologize if I'm going in and out.
You're fine right now.
I have to talk quickly in between this going in and out.
Okay. Go ahead, Chief. Chief, would you want to call in?
Hello?
Yes.
Am I live now?
Yes, you are.
I apologize. Like I said, I'm at the police station and my internet connection here at the department's going in and out. So I apologize, councilors. On behalf of Councilor Boschman's petition, I respectfully disagree with his evaluation on the need to increase our parking ban by 50%. Last year, my offices issued over 2,000 tickets, which generated the city of Fitchburg. At no point last year did we have any issues when we had a street that needed to be cleared for any reason. We were able to do that. The purpose behind any type of fine is to achieve voluntary compliance of not parking on the street. And just simply increasing this by 50% won't make this situation or this issue any less desirable. I don't think now's the time to be increasing any type of fines. Like I said, last winter, nothing really came to my attention that we had significant issues when it came to parking bans. 2,000 tickets somewhat low. And I don't think now's the time to be raising any fines. The purpose of like a fine, as I said, is to get any situation, and just simply doubling the fine.
I think at this point, Chief, I don't know if you can hear me. I think we've gotten the gist of what you were saying, that you don't think that doubling the fines is going to increase compliance in any way, and that has not been the problem in the past. I think if the chief if he wants to call back in and see if we get a better connection. But until then, I think Councilor Schultz had requested to speak. Councilor Schultz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just had a question for Councilor Boschman. I was wondering how he arrived at the $60 fee and doubling the fee. It seems like it's a pretty tough thing to do, especially like the chief said during a pandemic, to double the fine. So I just was wondering if Councilor Boschman could enlighten us on how he came up with that figure.
Councilor Boschman?
I came up with that figure because I was trying to have people park in the right proper places. I'm going to tell you and the chief this, that one day I was out plowing and there was a car parked. The guy waited 45 minutes for the car to move so he could plow the street. 2 big trucks were on that street, and the guy waited for 45 minutes. And I couldn't believe it. They didn't want to come back, so they waited for the party to move their car so they could plow the street. 45 minutes. So my argument was,
I believe I have a connection again, Councilor.
What's that? I didn't hear.
I'm just going to let Councilor Boschman finish his explanation, and then Chief, I'll put you right back on if that's okay. Councilor Boschman, please finish your.
And so I waited and I watched them because I was right down the street watching them. They had 2 big front end loaders trying to get by, and they couldn't. They had to wait for the guy to move. As a matter of fact, I went up there and I pushed some of the snow out so the person could move their car to get out. And that person that I helped push the snow out had a parking space in their own yard. They had parking in their own yard, and they refused to use it. And they took 2 guys waiting 45 minutes of our time, the taxpayers' money, to plow the street. And so I figured that if we gave $60, a lot of people won't want to park on the streets. They would park in their yards or somewhere else. I keep on emphasizing that if we leave them park on the street. Who's that? If we leave them park on the streets, it only costs them $30. It doesn't cost them anything but a $30 ticket. Where a homeowner, if they want to plow their driveway, costs anywhere from $40 to $60 or $50. So which is better, to pay the guy $50 to plow my driveway, or to pay the city of Fitchburg $30 and have them plow my street and come back and do it over again for $30?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Councilor Boschman. Yep. Chief, are you there? You're muted.
How was that?
You have not entered any numbers. Please re-enter the meeting password followed by.
Okay, you're good.
I'm good.
Yes.
I better talk quick because I have no idea what's going to happen to this internet connection. I still respectfully disagree with Councilor Boschman. I don't think now's the time to be increasing any fines. I think fines, the purpose of fine is to acquire voluntary compliance. I think my officers, we've done a good job every year getting out there and doing the best we can to open up the streets. We work very well with our DPW. Last year, we issued over 2,000 tickets, and that's a typical year. Actually, it was a little bit low in comparison to some other years. It's all dependent on the winter. And quite frankly, what Councilor Boschman's proposing, his ward is going to suffer the greatest on this. We're going to be doubling the fines for the constituents in the councilor's ward. Some people just don't have a place to park, and I'd rather work with them and find solutions than to just arbitrarily increase the fines by 50%. I don't think it's a good idea, and I have a hard time supporting the councilor's petition.
Oops. Thank you, Chief. Councilor Di Natale, you are next up. If you would like the floor is yours.
But just very briefly, this kind of legislation in general, whether it's $30 or $100 fine, to me is, and this is not a knock on the police or the DPW. I find these kinds of ordinances that are citywide to be very difficult to enforce. I get complaints every winter, as I'm sure all of you do, about cars parked on the streets or whatever. And the police, unfortunately, we don't have a cruiser on every street in this city. So the police are dealing with calls in addition to the snow mishaps that are going on with parking. And it's kind of like illegal dumping. It's like anything else in the city that's citywide, that unless you've got someone parked there at all points of the day, it's hard to enforce, but we do the best we can. No one has ever said to me that the $30 is why they choose to not abide by the ordinance. There are many instances where someone, because of their own personal situation, elderly, live far away from the garage, forgot to. It has nothing to do with the fees or the fines. I would wager to say residents don't even know what the fine is, because if you never gotten a ticket from it, you don't know what the fine is. As a homeowner, I would not want to leave my car on the street and say, come ticket me, Fitchburg, so I can get it plowed again. We're talking about having a private contractor plow my driveway versus a plow for the street. You know, if I'm getting ticketed for parking on an unplowed driveway, then yeah, I'd rather the city ticket me the $30 parked on my unplowed driveway instead of paying the $60 for a private contractor. We're talking about putting our car on a public street versus my driveway getting done. It's not the same thing. So whether you raise it to 60 or 100, I don't think it's going to deter any kind of activity. And I would wager to say that a lot of people, I have faith that if they do that, it is not out of malice. It's not out of a thumb in the eye to the city. There are many, many individual circumstances that may warrant that happening. And I know the police and the DPW, like everything else, the building, the health department, the fines are not meant to just be thrown at people. I'm sure the police give a notice or they try to get in touch with the person. If they're there, can you move the car? We're not here to try to find people left and right. But I don't think this is a matter that, unlike a matter like illegal dumping, where people are actively saying, I'm not moving my car off the street, go ahead and find me. And to equate it to driveway plowing is not the same thing. We're talking about on a public street, okay? Whether I'm getting my driveway plowed or not for more money is irrelevant if I'm gonna park on the street. So, you know, I just don't see the impact of what's taking place that $30 is going to correct or significantly mitigate. I just haven't seen it. And I haven't seen any data to suggest that the $30 is the reason why people are not abiding by the law. I would argue we're close to government. We're close to what goes on in the city every day. I would argue there's a lot of people in the city who don't even know that law exists, okay? So I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I'm sure the police have repeat offenders on their list, or they have records, obviously, of repeat offenders. If it's happened once, twice, 3 times, then yeah, I would make a case that these people are doing something on purpose. But you know, that rarely is the case. So I am against raising the fine, only because I don't understand how it's going to deter anything. I've seen no empirical evidence that says raising it to $60 is going to stop all of this from happening or significantly limited. I don't see that happening. We've raised fines in the past for illegal dumping. We raised them exponentially. Is illegal dumping still occurring? Yes. I'm not saying we don't fine them and we don't try to catch them and we don't raise the fines, but I would argue in some cases that the fine itself is not a deterrent for someone who wants to flout the law. They're going to break the law, whether they're going to get fined $100 or $300. We just have to catch them. In this case, I don't think that's going to be enough of a deterrent, especially for people who do not mean to have this happen. There's a lot of elderly in our city that this may happen to, that, you know, they either don't know or they're in a difficult circumstance where they're not doing it to cause a problem. So I don't see this as moving the ball forward on this matter at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Di Natale. Councilor Schultz for the second time. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Walsh. I agree with Councilor Di Natale. I think a lot of people in the city don't even know that they'd be fined if they, for some reason, had to leave their car on the street during the winter parking ban. And I also agree with Chief Martin, though, that you know, the police should be working with people that have a hard time finding a place to park their car in the wintertime during a ban. That, like he said, there are plenty of people in this city, and even in Councilor Boschman's Ward 2, that they don't have a place to park. They need to, you know, sometimes they just don't have a place to park. And so I think the police working with these people that you know have to leave their car off for whatever reason is a really good thing. And I just can't support this fee increase at this time, even especially during a pandemic.
Okay. Thank you, councilors. Councilor Zarella, I have a motion to approve on here. Is that the motion? Was that a motion to approve this petition, or was that a prior one that I missed?
That was the prior
Prior one. All right.
petition.
I would entertain a motion on 02820.
Motion for leave to withdraw.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion for leave to withdraw made by Councilor Zarella, seconded by Councilor Schultz. I will do this by roll call vote. Councilor Di Natale.
Yes.
You're muted. Yes. Councilor Schultz.
Yes.
Councilor Zarella.
Yes.
And I am a yes as well. That's 4-0 to give this leave to withdraw. The next item on the agenda, the last item on the agenda, is item number 12820. Councilor Paul Boschman to petition that all applications for a dealer's license must be for 10 cars minimum. This has also been referred to public safety and the building commissioner. Councilor Boschman, would you like to enlighten us as to the reasoning behind your petition, please?
The reason why I put that petition is because as I sit on public safety in different places, I see people coming in for used cars, licenses on small lots. They want to put car lots everywhere. The last one we had was 5. And I was following the example of our sister city next door. They raised their rates from whatever they had before up to 12 cars per. When you come down for a license, you got to have at least 12. I put down, what did I put down? I forget what I put down, but I figured that we should have a minimum of 10 if we're going to apply for a license, and not have them on every corner where people are taking just to have a used car lot. So that's the reason why I did it.
Okay, thank you, Councilor. I asked Chief Martineau if he wanted to comment on this, and Chief Martineau, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. I understand Councilor Boschman's petition in this aspect. However, I don't believe the police department should have an opinion on the number of cars that any dealer should be granted. Our position on used car dealers is more of a regulatory standard when it comes to dealer plates and the suitability of the dealer themselves, as far as the amount of cars that should be regulated on any given lot or granted with any license. I believe that's more of a planning board, more of a building department issue. So on this matter and before you this evening, there would be no opinion from the police department.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Do I have any questions for Councilor Boschman? Councilor Zarella.
So I'm broadly in favor of the idea of putting some sort of minimum, because sitting on the zoning board as I do, we do see some petitions for very small used car lots, and frankly, I share Councillor Boschman's sentiment that they can come across as essentially clutter in the city. Got a small lot, don't know what to do with it, put a few cars on it. And there are some of these across the city that are well run. Many are not. Many who, many of the operators who do not have the wherewithal to put at least 6 or 7 or 8 cars on a lot, don't have the wherewithal to make it a professional operation. And we often see it as kind of a throw it in thing, where someone who doesn't really have any expertise in this thinks I can make a quick buck by flipping a few cars now and then. It can come across as blight. I'm not sure 10 is the right number. I would consider possibly a little bit lower, because we do have some small lots that really aren't suitable for much else, but that could potentially accommodate 6 to 8 cars. But if you're applying for a license for 4 cars on the lot, absent special circumstances, that seems a bit much. That being said, I would like to see the option for some sort of supermajority override on any minimum limit that we set, so that if there are special circumstances where a lower number is uniquely appropriate for a particular lot, that person can petition for an override, and we could theoretically grant it if we agree, with a strong presumption against.
Thank you, Councilor Zarella. Councilor Schultz?
Yeah, I was wondering, after listening to Councilor Zarella, that maybe, I was wondering if Councilor Boschman would be amenable to maybe reducing that number to like 6 to 8 cars, because it seems like 10 is probably too many for a minimum, but maybe 6 to 8 would be more in line. Like Councilor Zarella said, we've got some small lots that, can only hold that number of cars, or, wouldn't be worth doing anything else with that particular piece of property. So maybe Councilor Boschman could maybe amend that minimum. But I also agree with Councilor Zarella that, it should also be open to, an override if people could come and say, geez, I can only do, 5 cars or whatever, or 7 cars, So I think if we could lower that number, maybe it would be more acceptable to people. It would be more acceptable to me anyway.
I don't understand. I guess I think that this is more of a license problem. If someone petitions or requests a license and they're granted a license, I think if someone is not qualified or able to maintain the property, then you pull their license.
Right.
And
I agree with that.
I just don't feel like, I think setting an artificial minimum makes no sense to me. And I feel like especially in this time, where we have a number of people who are trying to maintain businesses, if we have people who are having they can open a small business, I think we should encourage that, not discourage it. Councilor Zarella.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that does make sense to me. I think the concern would be more with the very small lots where it's not really a business so much as a sideline, which may be helpful to a business person in Fitchburg, but we also have to consider the impact on the area, where in some cases, depending on the use, it may actually be more advantageous to have an empty lot that can be sold to an adjoining business for parking or something. But I take the point. I do just want to note for a procedure. No, I'm sorry. Never mind. I'll bring that up later. So I'm having heard the arguments going both ways. I'm ambivalent on the subject.
So am I.
Councilor Boishman?
I hear what you're saying, Councilor, but not Councilor Zarella, Madam Chair. But I want to point out to you that a couple of times that used cars came into our place, we set a number of car limits to them. The prime example was River Street Auto on River Street. The guy came in and we said, why don't you put 50 cars up there? And I think Councilor Di Natale will remember that when he came in front of us at Dufour. And then you had where I argued the place against on Water Street, down on the Leominster Water Street line, where we gave that guy an unlimited amount of cars. And I said, we ought to set a limit of how many cars you can have and let him come back in front of the council, whoever you had to. And nobody agreed. So we have the right to set the limits, and we have the right to set how many cars we want and how high you can go. So I disagree with the way you talk, Councilor, Madam Chair. I think that we're making a big mistake. I think if you talk to the building commissioner, he even recommended it to me too, that we ought to start looking, changing the bar, that we got a lot of used car lots coming in. They're selling nothing but cheap cars to the public. Is that what we want to do? We want to raise the bar. That's my argument. We're becoming like I use a Dunkin' Donuts, which put one on every corner. Why would you want that? Just to say we got business? It doesn't make sense to me. All right, that's all I
Okay,
have.
thank you, Councilor. Councilor Di Natale?
I know the chief is weighing in. The counselor invoked the building commissioner as well. I'm not at a point where I'll say no to this, and maybe not so much the limit number, but I'm open to further discussion on this. But I think if at a minimum, maybe it should be held until we get more information on this matter. Maybe have the building commissioner involved along with the police chief, fire. I mean, these are decisions that are typically made. Well, I don't know, Chief, is this really in your jurisdiction for the most part with these licensures?
We facilitate, we sit on the public safety, and the licensee submits their application to the clerk's office, and the clerk's office does their background check. And if need be, we can weigh in during executive session with regards to the applicant based on what the clerk's office pulls for data. Also, like I said earlier, we regulate any dealer plates that may be issued to the individual dealer. As far as setting limitations on whether it's 5 cars, 10 cars, 20 cars, I think that's more of a building and planning board issue, but I don't think that we should be weighing in on how many cars. I do recall one applicant last year put in an application for a dealer's license, and they didn't even have a lot. They were selling cars. I believe they went to Fitchburg State, and they were selling cars, and they lived on campus. So I think this is an important conversation, but I'm just not sure that the police department should be weighing in on the number of cars.
Okay, I have a motion to hold from Councilor Schultz.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, and Councilor Zarella speaking to the motion, and then Councilor Di Natale, you'll be next.
Thank you. I just wanted to note, Chief Martineau reminded me of something that I should have thought of sooner, which is that limitations on number of cars often are included in whatever approvals the zoning board grants, and presumably the planning board as well. And that can be a lower number than the license that the council grants. And I would agree, actually, that that would be the better body to address context-sensitive individual lot use questions like that.
And Councilor Zarella, that would be the planning board? Is that what you're
Or
saying?
zoning board, whichever
zoning
it goes
board.
in front
Okay,
of.
thank you.
It depends on the zone. And I would also note that that can be something that I can bring to, or that, well, really that either of us, Madam Chair, can bring to the working group for the zoning overhaul rather than writing it into the licensure law. But I would support holding this for the moment.
Okay. Councilor Di Natale?
I'm all set. I was going to say about holding it that I think we need to bring in other people into this, and there are other matters affecting stuff like this that I've brought to the attention of zoning and building, and they're all getting mixed into this comprehensive zoning package that Tom Skorsky is working on with a whole slew of zoning changes. So definitely hold this for future discussion, and definitely something we should revisit, because I do recall some instances that the councilor mentioned years ago where we were wringing our hands over how many cars to put in. We put in a number of cars and they wouldn't abide by it, and this and that, and so it was very tough to deal with. So this is something that definitely should be looked at, but by people that are not here tonight that need to consult. We need to consult with. Thank you.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I think we have a motion to hold and second until the particular, so planning, zoning, and the building commissioner can weigh in. We can refer this to them, ask for their opinion, and then we'll hold this until such time as they weigh in on this matter. So we have a motion and second to hold. We'll do this by roll call vote. Councilor Di Natale?
Yes.
Councilor Schultz?
Yes.
Councilor Zarella?
Yes.
And I am a yes, so that's 4-0 to hold. FATV, I had a note that Mr. Cook had joined to comment on another petition, 19220. Is he still available, or has he left the meeting?
Councilor Walsh, that petitioner has left the meeting.
Okay, thank you. At this time, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Seconded.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.